Teaching to me is a way of being. I think if you want to be a teacher, you're taking on a particular way of being with people. You care as much more about their success than you do your own.
There was a culture that came across from the community college way back when, so 67, right? And I knew a few of those guys, not really as university professors, but as people who had started off in the college or had started off the idea of the university in the college. They wanted to separate themselves from the college mentality of just unload the hay, teach, do all those kinds of things. And they wanted to get into a more academic environment.
Well, I think first and foremost that we were able to maintain an emphasis on teaching and teaching excellence. So, the way the university started had a lot to do with that.
And I think people also choose to come here because of the caliber of the teaching and because people have a way of connecting what they do clinically or research-wise into the classroom.
Well, I think, when I came to teaching, I didn't have really any formal training. So I relied on a lot of my colleagues.
Because you're constantly learning about how to teach, and you're not taught anything at the start, so you don't really have any preconceived notions on how this ought to be. So you're open to experimentation.
If we assume that there's some credibility to the notion that in the absence of formal training that we will default to the way we were taught, then maybe we are getting a population of professors and of academics who were taught differently, who are the result of a focus over the last 10 or 15 years across the world on better tertiary teaching, on more effective practices in teaching at the post-secondary level.
And I feel like I've stolen from all of my professors over my 10 years, right? And I've just taken things that I've thought have worked really well for them or that really worked well, that I found worked well for me that they did, and I've tried to replicate those things. And some of the stuff doesn't work, some of it does when you try it out yourself, but it's kind of this mixture of all the professors that I had classes with. And so I think, one of my former instructors is really interested in academic genealogies, and I think that's really important, right? I think if you pay attention to who you were taught by, it really shows the way that knowledge has changed, how knowledge is crafted, and how you're sort of building on this longer tradition that ties back in all sorts of interesting directions.
50 years ago, when you went into a lecture, many times you didn't know where it was going. And the part of the fun of following a lecture, especially an excellent one, was the sort of discovery. Like a good narrative, where are the pitfalls? Where's the solution to this problem that you've described? And it gets exciting if you're following along on the story.
Well, first of all, the goal of education is to transform individuals and society. So 30 years ago, I found that we used to use the traditional way of teaching, top down, go and read, and come back to the classroom, give exams, right? So over time, because of the generational demography changes, and the level of education has changed, the content has changed, and the goal of the students to learning has changed. Same with the educators like us. So it has changed from traditional way to now interactive, transformative way.
I was a student here back in the 80s, so I got my undergraduate from the University of Lethbridge, and it was a very different system then. It was more of a lecture-based education that I received, and not that I think there's anything wrong with that, but I think we have moved more from that lecture base to more active learning education style.
People taught the way they had been taught. And I really do think that is changing. I think more and more gone are the lecture classroom type environments where, I deliver my knowledge to you and you sit there and passively take it. Students are more engaged now. They don't want that kind of delivery more often than not. They want to interact and engage with you. They want to have a conversation, and I think that certainly drives my teaching practice. I want them to ask difficult questions that challenge me because it makes me think creatively. It makes me search for answers. It keeps me engaged in teaching.
Well, I'm different. I mean, if I told you about my first classroom where I thought, well, we'll start with the neuron, we'll start with the basics and work our way up. I don't think that way anymore. The chances are if you take a course to me, you'll never get to the basics. I'm just not interested in them. I'm interested in the procedure that produced the basics. And can I teach you that and you'll produce your own basics? Or, you know, I mean, that was a radical change for me if I had to, you know, in one sentence sum up how I changed.
I think the older I get, the more experimental I am. So I started out with standard lectures, and then I moved into bringing in some independent work, bringing in some discussion, trying to wake the class up, I think, in some ways. And I did exams. I thought that conveying the material was what I was supposed to do, and as I have got older and maybe wiser, I have thought, no, I need to be giving them abilities. Because the facts that we have today, they may not even be facts 10 years from now. But the ability to go find the facts, that stays with students.
Ultimately, the student has to teach themselves. We are the facilitators. So I can compare myself to a guide. So you want to hike up in the mountains. Okay, I'm the guide. So I will show you how to lace your boots. I'll tell you what to do if we see a bear. I'll tell you what supplies to bring. But I'm not going to carry you up the mountain. I'm not your porter. I'm the guide. You got to climb the mountain yourself. Now, when we get up there, the view is incredible.
Because we all communicate in our own ways. I mean, disciplinary ways. So the way a historian communicates history is different than the way a physicist communicates physics. And so really the only way for a student to learn facility and communication in these different areas is to kind of take courses in those different areas, I think. And I guess then for us as faculty members to try and make sure that that communication component is something that we're teaching, right? Not just the content of our course material, but that we're also instructing students how to communicate.
My reason for getting away from content was kind of that first of all, I don't think that's what they need. But second, that content is everywhere. So if they can go watch the television or, you know, whatever they're going to do to get information, they don't need to get it all from us. And they don't. So that means we have the ability to shift to say, not so much, here's what you should learn, but here's what you should do with what you're learning.
The people who are teaching and the people who are being taught change in context. And so everybody needs to adapt as you go along to make sure that you're doing something that's effective in the circumstances.
So the first question is, who are these learners? And has the learner changed? And there can be some evidence on both sides of the argument that they really haven't changed and we just have not attended to some of the old theories of learning. And there can be contentions made that they have changed and that they're bringing different profiles into the classroom as a learner.
So students, I love them dearly, and I was just showing Todd before we started a picture from the 14th century. I'll probably butcher the artist's name, but it was Volotopina, and it was a picture of the person teaching, and there was a couple of people that were talking. One, student was asleep, and there's the talking, not listening. One person was reading a book. So no technology, but you see the same thing today. Like, students really haven't changed. There's, that the tools that we doodle on are different. It used to be paper, and you'd pass notes, and now it could be, all these different smartphones and so forth.
They've had more life experiences earlier in life in terms of travel and doing things. There's some very impressive young people that have done really neat volunteer things and really neat projects and moved ahead in that regard, and I think that's really impressive. The other thing that has changed, and this is a great thing, is there's more ethnic diversity in our classes. You know, when I came here, it was pretty one group of people, and we don't have that anymore, and I think that's exciting.
Now we're seeing people from all over, from away, international students who bring such, wonderful gifts to us of education. The First Nation, Métis, and Inuit students who were right here in Blackfoot territory, and so they bring us stuff. And that's changed how I think teaching is, because you have to start thinking, I've got a bunch of different people with a bunch of different perspectives coming, so I can't just use the same old canned stuff. I've got to teach to the different multiple intelligences in the room, the naturalists, the people who are more kinesthetic, more auditory, the interpersonal people, the intrapersonal people. So being aware of those things has really, I think, made me hopefully a better teacher. But then I've made many mistakes, and that's made me a better teacher as well.
We do have a profile of a learner, and yes, we can argue that that has changed, or that in other aspects it hasn't. Has the learning context changed? We can argue that it has. Technology is more pervasive in classrooms.
We're also much more technologically connected. I think in some ways the students expect more information from us. They also know where to get information not from us.
You're competing with Google. If you're trying to produce something that people haven't seen before, they can always look it up online. They can download and watch on YouTube somebody giving a lecture on it. So you're not in any sense as important a source of stuff as people used to be before. So you have to complement that aspect of it with other things that engage people.
If I'm just delivering knowledge in the classroom, and the students already have that through slides I send out or whatever, and my class of 60 all of a sudden turns to be 15 people in the classroom, I would say to myself, well, I mustn't provide much value there, right? And so I try and make sure that there's a reason for students to come, that I'm providing some additional added value learning than just giving them information. And the feedback that I get from students is that they appreciate that. They appreciate an environment whereby I feel that I'm providing something more than just giving them information.
Anytime, anywhere, learning is becoming the mantra for many students who want to take advantage of synchronous and asynchronous learning.
Students can be from different provinces on online courses, which is exciting, especially if it's an elective. I teach an elective on rural health. I've had students from 3 different provinces on there. It's great because people's perspectives are really interesting about how they view things. And there's ways of having them introduce each other online, get to know one another. There's ways of doing different kind of activities so that it's like they're in a classroom, but they're not. And those, I think, are really exciting.
Class sizes are larger, some would argue, and students are in classes that look physically different.
I teach 2 different classes typically, one a very small class on research methods, so I get to know the students very well, and one a larger class, up to 300 students, on how the brain works, introduction to brain and behavior. And I find that both offer some very interesting opportunities as far as teaching go, because in the larger classes, sometimes you pick up students who wouldn't typically be interested at all in the sort of work that we do. But in the smaller classes, we really get to know the students, and I have an opportunity to work on skills for them, so they can work on their oral presentation skills, they can work on their writing skills, and by the end of the semester, not only have they learned the material involved in the course, the research methods, they tend to have acquired all sorts of other skills as well by developing their ability to communicate with others. So it's a wonderful opportunity. And when you get to know the students at that kind of a level, a 3-hour class once a week, and then see their writing and their oral presentation, you get a better understanding of the students themselves.
So has teaching changed? If we say that learners and the learning context has changed, but we answer no to has teaching changed, we have created our own gap in learning and teaching. I would hope that we would say that because we're acknowledging that learners have changed in some ways, large or small, and that the classroom environment and the context has changed in ways large and or small, that teaching has changed in some ways.
Well, I guess as you get older teaching, or at least as I've gotten more experience teaching, you start to calm down a bit, I guess would be the way I'd think of it, right? So I'm not so obsessive about getting all of the data through. I remember my first time teaching back in 1999. I just wanted the students to know every single thing there was to know about ancient Egypt, right? And so eventually that goes away, right? You start realizing that's not possible, that doesn't make any sense, and so you can start tailoring your lectures more towards other pedagogical goals that make sense, right?
Learning that you can be flexible. You don't need a lot of rigidity. The students are probably just as terrified as you are the first time you walk in a classroom. And you learn. I learned. I was pretty rigid when I started teaching. I was teaching a science course, and there were chapters in a book that all had to be covered, and it was my job to make sure we covered from the beginning to the end. And after a few years, I realized, no, we don't need to do this chapter, and I can cut back on this, and I can do that, and it was okay.
So that notion of being able to feel comfortable questioning our teaching practice is really a big shift, and it's one that's a difficult one.
One of the good fortunate things about being a university prof is that you can actually, you're not burdened by kind of people from above telling you how you ought to teach and what needs to be done and the methods that you use. So I'm willing to experiment with things, and sometimes I'll go, how could I better teach this course? Well, let me try this out. And I'm willing to give it a try, and then I'll examine the process and how it went that one semester, and if I'll tweak it as the semester goes on if I can, but I'm constantly reevaluating what I have taught, how I've structured a course, and how I might do it differently the next time to improve the learning experience. I don't know, I find that personally rewarding. So, but I'm not afraid to experiment with something new.
In a university setting, you're able to experiment a lot. You're not told exactly what to do. And I guess that's one of the good aspects of being thrown into teaching without any prior experiences. You learn really rapidly, but you learn really well too, fairly fast, because you have to. You don't have any choice, and you have your trial and error periods. And believe me, learning by trial and error is always the better way to learn, because it takes a lot longer, a lot harder, but you remember it a lot better.
First time I teach a course, I don't necessarily know what students are going to find difficult. And if they ask me questions, I can immediately respond and say, oh, I didn't do a very good job on that small topic, and fix it right there.
One of the things I've really seen a difference in the classroom is that the learners are contributors and not just passive, receptors of the knowledge.
So I think what you can do is get them to talk with each other in different ways. You can set some questions or problems up if you're in a very big class. I think the biggest class I've taught is 240 students, and that was never a year. So when you have 1,000 students, it does make a difference. So I think it's a responsibility to have some interesting materials and have some real questions, but also asking what the students' questions are. Because we quite often as professors, I think, say, here are the questions, here are the big questions, and what is your response? And I am more interested in rogue questions. Like, here are the set of questions, sure. Here's some of the things I've been thinking about as a person thinking about this topic. What are your questions? Really, what are your questions? And accepting all sorts of rogue questions and putting them up there and letting them be in the public space to think about. And some of them will fade into anonymity, which they should. But the worthy questions, I think, will abide. And so we continue to work at those questions.
Teaching is still an act of relationship and interaction between two human beings. And so the fundamental relationship of trust and of reciprocal curiosity, all of the soft aspects that we talk about in teaching have not changed. Most students will tell us that of the 3 big clusters of teaching, those clusters being knowledge, skills that professors have, and then attitudes that they have, that the most important qualities to them as learners are still those soft skills around the attitudes, the sense of humor, the humanness, the relationship building, the professional support and affirmation, the positivity. Those are at the core of good teaching. And students still want us to be able to interact and teach them having those soft skills. So in that regard, teaching has not changed over decades. What has changed is the whole area of the skill and knowledge clusters. So it takes a much different professor to teach 400 students in a way that's engaging, that might be interactive, that might have them interacting with each other in a social constructivist way and having them interact with technology than it used to when we would accept that the stand and deliver lecture was the most effective didactic means of transferring knowledge.
Students have access to information in a whole different way than we did when I started. Right now we've got this whole social media thing. And so I think there's a good thing, which is I think there's a tendency to question more, to wonder what's going on, to be more informed. And I think as a professor, you have to be more informed. And you have to think about, how can I use technology in a good way to enhance my teaching? How can I engage these students? Because they're very engaged in all this social media and that visual stuff. So it's a different kind of way of teaching. You have to think about that. How can we work with students to make that a better experience for them?
I began to know the students, and I began to see where they went and what they did afterwards, and I began to think of them as people, each of whom was an individual, each of whom had different needs, each of whom had different techniques. And so I began to think, wait a minute, I'm not teaching a body of people, I'm teaching a group of individuals, all of whom are different. I think that had a lot to do with it.
I think teaching has changed a little bit. I think that we now realize the importance of that relationship between the student and the teacher and how really valuable that relationship is to helping a student learn.
It's fun. I like teaching. But I mean, one of the reasons I'm still here is I love it. And I think that's just fine. We should have more people who love it.